Hey everyone! Today we'll be diagnosing the misfire in my 1992 Acura Legend. Stay tuned. In the continuing saga of my 1992 Acura Legend, I recently resolved the no-start condition and I'm now focused on the misfire. So I thought I'd review some of the more common causes of misfires in the Acura Legend. Now this is by no means an exhaustive list, it's just a starting point. In no particular order, I'll start with the ignition coils. The ignition coils provide power to the spark plugs, and if one of those fails, a misfire definitely will develop. So you can check the coils first of all by doing a visual inspection. And what I would look for is a torn boot, maybe look for some cracking in the housing, and also look for corrosion where the coil and the spark plug make contact. If the ignition coil passes a visual inspection, I'd next check the resistance between the coil's two terminals with the multimeter. We're looking for 0.9 to 1.1 ohms with the coil at 77 degrees Fahrenheit. And according to the service manual, this resistance can vary based on the coil's temperature. If the resistance is not within spec, replace the coil. While investigating the ignition coils, I'd also pull the spark plugs and check them for damage at the tip and look for any carbon fouling or any broken porcelain. I'd also check to make sure the spark plugs are tightened to the 13 pound-foot specification. A tool like a spark tester may also come in handy. Oil seeping into the spark plug wells can also cause a misfire, and the main source of oil pooling in the spark plug wells is the tube seals on the underside of the valve cover. If you notice oil in the tubes, it's a good idea to replace the valve cover gasket set, which includes the tube seals. Another less common cause of oil pooling in one or more spark plug wells is the O-rings between the cylinder head and the valve train. I actually forgot to change these O-rings when I replaced my valve seals a decade ago, and the O-rings were dry and brittle when I finally replaced them. Again, those are just a few starting points, and I'll put a link in the description below to the service manual. Specifically, check out the troubleshooting guides in the fuel and emissions section. Since I got busy with work and I really didn't have a whole lot of time to keep investigating this misfire, I took the Legend to a local shop a couple years ago. The misfire was very slight at that time, and the shop found that the EGR passage was clogged and possibly causing a misfire in cylinder number 2. So since I didn't really want to spend the $600 to have them clean the EGR passage for me, I decided to clean it myself. But the misfire still remained after cleaning the passage. And that brings us to possibly the most common cause of misfires in the Legend: fuel injectors. After doing some research, I decided to take the DIY route and clean the fuel injectors myself. After my attempt, which was possibly DIY or error, I still had a misfire. I finally come full circle and decided to start things over from the top and truly verify whether one or more fuel injectors is having issues. So I'm just going to do a sample injector test on cylinder number 2. So what I've done here is disconnected the harness connector. And to do that, all you have to do is take a pick tool and slip it under each of the corners of the metal clip on top of the injector harness. And what that will do is spread the clip's legs on the bottom of the harness. The first test I'm going to do here is a resistance test. So the multimeter is on the resistance setting, and I'll just touch the black probe to one injector terminal and the red probe to the other terminal. And what we're looking for is 1.5 to 2.5 ohms. If the injector is not within spec, it should be replaced. I'm next going to start the car and check for clicking at the injector. If it clicks continuously with the car running, we'll call the injector and the circuit electrically good. But we can still also have a clogged or leaking injector. Otherwise, we'll need to investigate the wiring or possibly the ECU. So injector number 2 is clicking, and we just repeat these tests for the other injectors. Alright, so all the injectors in the circuit are electrically good, so we're going to take this a step further. I have 2 cameras set up, one monitoring the engine compartment and the second mounted inside the car and pointed at the tachometer. So with the engine running, what we're going to do is pull an injector harness connector at a time to see if one or more of the injectors is not doing its part. And what should happen is when an injector is disconnected, we should see the engine speed drop and hear the idle change. If this does not happen, the injector is most likely clogged. To set up for this test, the engine has been warmed slightly. And what I'll do is announce each injector as I disconnect and reconnect its harness. And here we go. Pulling injector number 1. Plugging injector number 1 back in. Pulling injector number 2. Injector number 2 pulled. Plugging injector number 2 back in. Two plugged back in, pulling number 3. Plugging 3 back in. Pulling number 4. Plugging 4 back in. Four plugged in, pulling number 5. Pulled injector number 5. Five plugged back in. Pulling number 6. Number 6 pulled. Plugging number 6 back in. So it appears that we have a clog in injector number 2. For now, I'm going to replace injector number 2. I have a full set of professionally remanned injectors on order. And ideally, it's a good idea to replace all 6 injectors with new or professionally cleaned injectors at the same time, or have them all cleaned. I personally would only replace the injectors with OEM Honda Acura myself. So I picked up an injector while I was at the salvage yard and subsequently had it ultrasonically cleaned and flow tested by a local shop. To get started replacing the fuel injector in cylinder number 2, I've let the engine cool to avoid a tragedy here. And just in case I need it, I've also verified that my fire extinguisher is charged and ready for use. Next, we'll basically repeat the process to depressurize the fuel system, which includes disconnecting the negative battery terminal, opening the fuel filler cap, and loosening the bolt on top of the fuel filter one turn. Since we'll need to lift the right fuel rail to replace the injector, I've disconnected the harness connectors for injectors 1 through 3. The wiring harness needs to be lifted off the studs on the fuel rail. The ground wire on the fuel rail needs to be disconnected, and that just requires removing the 10mm bolt. Now, I broke the clip near the firewall that holds the fuel line down, so it'll be easy for me to lift the fuel line out of the way so I can lift up the fuel rail. You may have to remove the strut bar and unclip the fuel line in your case. I'll then stuff some paper towels around the fuel line at the rear of the fuel rail. Then I'll remove that nut using a 17mm socket. There are 2 10mm nuts holding the fuel rail down. Those have to be removed. Then evenly lift up on both ends of the fuel rail, making sure the injectors come out of the intake with the fuel rail. At this point, I would have some paper towels ready because when you pull the injector from the fuel rail, some of the fuel is going to come running out of the fuel rail. Here's our professionally cleaned OEM fuel injector, and it's got a brand new O-ring and new washers. Before I install the injector onto the fuel rail, I'm going to apply a little clean engine oil to the green O-ring. Also, I'm going to line up the arrow between the injector's terminals with the arrow on the fuel rail. Before I insert the injectors into the intake, I'm going to apply some clean engine oil to the washers. I'm just going to reinstall everything in reverse here. So the torque spec for the two 10mm nuts is 9 pound-feet, and the fuel line nut spec is 16 pound-feet. If you haven't already tightened the bolt on top of the fuel filter, that should be tightened down to 9 pound-feet. Now that we've replaced the injector, I'm going to start the car. I'm also going to pull the harness connector for injector number 2 to verify it's contributing to the cause. I'm going to pull injector number 2. Well, it looks like the car is running smoother, but it's still not quite right. And it appears that the catalytic converter may be an innocent bystander.